Welcome to the Success Talk Show, the podcast for ambitious leaders who want to get their best results and create a workplace for their teams to thrive. Each week, we share practical advice to help you accelerate your success and grow as an inspiring leader. Now, here's your host, Leadership Success Coach, Donna Sirianni.
Welcome to another episode of the Success Talk Show for ambitious leaders. This is Donna Sirianni, Leadership Success Coach, and I'm thrilled to have as our special guest today, Dave Melville, CEO of the Bowdoin Group. And as the CEO of a highly successful recruiting firm, Dave's vision has always been to change the way people think about recruiting. His company provides customized recruiting solutions to leading and innovative companies, primarily in the technology, financial services, and healthcare industries. And one of the things I love about Dave is that his mission is to provide fulfilling careers for both his own employees and the candidates they work with. So Dave, welcome.
Hi, Donna. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Dave, for making the time for us today. And Dave, I want to dive right in. My first question is, as the CEO of a successful recruiting company, I know you've placed thousands of leaders in key roles. So I'm curious, what are the top leadership skills that are most sought after?
You know, the number one thing people need when seeking a leader is someone that can clearly articulate the vision that they have for their group, their team, and the people in it. They need people that know how to delegate appropriately. Mm-hmm. And they need people that, I don't know where it's difficult, but know how to make the appropriate decision, based on the data and analytics that they're provided, and aligning it with the vision and mission where they're trying to go.
So that's really interesting, Dave. So I'm curious, when we think about the leaders going for a role, let's say, they're going for a role that might advance their career. What advice would you have on how they're able to convey to that potential hiring manager that they're able to communicate the vision for their group, that they have that, that communication skill?
Right. So I think that the best way when you're interviewing for any role, regardless of level, is to communicate through past experiences that you've had, how you will be able to parlay those past experiences into what you're doing in the future. And I think, if you can give examples, if we're talking about leadership specifically, of when you've had to align your team, the decision you made on what your strategy would be aligning them, what you actually did, the actions that you took, and then what the results were after you aligned them. If you can demonstrate to people success multiple times, they're more inclined to allow you to do it again or give you an opportunity for a bigger role.
Mm-hmm. And when you mentioned delegating, which is fascinating because that does tend to be such a sticking point for so many leaders as they try and do too much themselves and they don't delegate. And, it's interesting because I'm thinking back on so many interviews that I've either been a part of on either side of the table. I'm not so sure that folks really asked a lot about delegating, but it's crucial. And I'm curious, if you're a candidate and that doesn't actually come up, is that something you should be proactive in sharing how, what your style is for delegating?
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. I think it's more, how do you empower and grow your team? As a leader, which is, if we define that differently than a manager whose job is to, help people do very specific tasks. As a leader, you need to grow and scale. You need to rapidly continue to empower and grow your team. So I wouldn't really necessarily say it was delegating, because that's easy to do. Just say, here, you do this. But it's how you were able to get people into a learning environment and continue to grow them.
Yeah, Dave, thanks for that clarification, because that I can see is crucial. And as, I'm sure you and I have both looked at quite a bit, if you want to have a team that's highly engaged, they're growing, they're advancing their skills, and even to have succession plans and to have people being able to step into those more senior roles. I love that advice because so often I see leaders who are focused on getting the job done, getting the results, but they really sometimes ignore what do they need to do for their team to help grow the team's capabilities. So I think that's great advice. In terms of empowerment, is there anything else you want to share? Because I know you've been very successful at that. And I'm just curious, any other tips you have on empowerment?
I think, Donna, you and I have talked about a lot when you've done work with our company. And, things we focus on here, as you know, is identifying what people's skills are. And, really trying to get them to be honest with their skills and their teammates and you be honest with their skills. And then putting them in the best possible position that they can succeed, both for themselves and for the company. And, too often it's very easy for us to align people into roles that we need them to be in, where they are almost doomed to fail because they don't have the skills or training to do it or abilities, or because they think it'll be cool. And they don't really know, they haven't really thought about their skills, right? So I think, as you and I have talked about many times, it's understanding what people's strengths are and then leveraging that as much as possible. And if there becomes a disconnect over time, that's okay. Then they can continue to advance their career in the right spot for them. Regardless, creates a really good culture.
And just tapping into that, because something that I know you've put a lot of thought into is one of the things that I know was really powerful. I saw powerful impact when I first stepped into the Bowdoin Group is that, many companies have a set of company values or workplace values. And if you ask people, if you catch them in the hallway and say, so what are the values for the company? They would really be hard pressed to answer. They don't really know because maybe it's on a website somewhere. And what I loved was how you have the actual company values all over the wall. I mean, it would be hard to mistake, and I could ask anybody and they know exactly what the values are. And I've actually quizzed them and they know examples of where they've shown teamwork, excellence, curiosity, etc. And I think that's really powerful. So I'm just curious your position on, having a set of clear values.
In today's environment, it's interesting as compared to when I started many years ago. People now really want to know what the company's values are. And they want to see how it's aligned to it. Whereas, when I started to work for Procter & Gamble out of school, Procter & Gamble has great values, but I didn't know what they were, nor did I personally really care. It had no factoring into what I was doing as a company. But now people do want to know what it is. But also, I think that when you create the right form of values, it makes decisions that would be otherwise difficult very easy. Or it makes conversations that would be otherwise difficult much more easy, because you can clearly anchor on something. Here's what we're looking for. Here's our value. This isn't where we stray. And it can provide a lot of clarity. But I also think it makes people feel good about, what they do every day. In our business, we're a people business, and no matter what we do affects people's lives. And in the day, it's easy to forget that in the day-to-day movement and speed of things. And that's wanting to have a positive impact is something that really anchors us and I think helps us attract the right people and keep them as well.
And one thing I've heard you speak about in the past when you say, people really need to have, a set of values that serve as an anchor. And then, you also know what you stand for. And one thing I'd love to hear your comments on is you've mentioned how it's really important when you're interviewing a leader to take an important role in your firm to understand their why. And so I'm curious if you could comment on that.
That's right. So in order to predict, it sort of goes back to the same conversation we had a little bit earlier, in order to predict, future behavior, you not only want to know what people have done, but why they did it, what gets up and motivates them every day. And when you understand that, you get to know the person through examples and through their passion, what their interests have been. You can understand what their willingness, what their drive is to succeed, what their willingness to overcome obstacles, et cetera. We do a lot in the healthcare industry. And, you get a lot of our startup companies that are in specifically health tech. And they try to sell their new technologies to hospitals. And it's a very slow, laborious process to sell into a hospital for anybody that's ever actually tried it. Even if its sale is really helpful to the hospital, it's very hard to get through. And a lot of the companies that we work with look for people that have a deep embedded passion in healthcare and what they're focused on, because they know if they have that internal drive and they've been involved in this, they will not give up. They'll succeed. But if it's just a transaction to them, it's very hard. I know investors that look for that as well when they're investing in the company, particularly in healthcare.
Yeah, it's interesting. I might have shared the story with you. I have a coaching client who is an, senior partner at a firm and an auditor. And, auditing per se isn't necessarily the passion, but loves working with companies that save lives, loves working with in the healthcare industry. And so, I thought of that, as you were talking about the why. So that's really interesting to just dig a little deeper and, having that conversation to make sure it is a good fit and you really understand what's going to motivate that person when the going gets tough. Yeah. So, and Dave, one other thing you mentioned I'd really love to hear your thoughts on is you mentioned one of the top leadership qualities that are most sought after is, a leader who can make either difficult or appropriate decisions. And so if I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. If you could maybe give an example of what that would look like.
One of the things that it's called, the term that people use is managerial courage, and that's to make a difficult decision, and by that it's usually something that will potentially have a short-term negative impact, or it will potentially have a long-term lasting impact if you make the wrong one. And it's exceptionally easy to become paralyzed and unable to make a decision. And it's also easy, if there's going to be a short-term negative impact, for sometimes to stray from your values. And so one of the things that we do when screening people is we talk about the different difficult decisions that they've made, and we weigh a couple things. One, was it a really difficult decision compared to the roles that they're going to be going into? And then two, how did they come about making it? And it almost doesn't matter whether it was right or wrong. Quite often, it's just how the process they used. And, an example I can think of is I was talking to a leader, and they had asked them that question, and they had their top salesperson, had done something unethical with a client. And to me, they were interviewing for our company. That was a very easy decision. If that happens, it doesn't matter what they're ranked as a salesperson, they would leave the company, even if it had a major short-term, impact. They ultimately did let the person go, but they dragged it out over several months in this sort of long, tedious decision. And that told us that this person probably wasn't the right person for us. Because for us, we have to stick with our values. So that's just a small example, but that's something is something that companies look for.
Yeah. And Dave, I just thought of something when you were sharing that story. Thank you for giving that example. And I just thought of something that, I could see even if I was a leader being interviewed for a key role and I want to see how that potential employer lives their values, I could see that being a very good sort of reverse question of, in what way does the company demonstrate its values? What are some of the tangible ways? Because we all know that, actions speak louder than words. And some companies do have a set of values, but you'd be hard pressed to find examples of where they're actually brought to life. So, with how you're running your company, I can see where that, the values really are a compass guiding behavior and directions. So thank you for that. So I'm curious, when you see leaders going into interviews that really could take their career to the next level, it could be somebody's looking to get into a more senior position and, maybe they're aspiring to greater heights in their career. What are some of the common mistakes that you see them make as they approach that interview process?
Right. That's a really good question. And it's very difficult, which I completely understand, when you're being given the opportunity, maybe of your lifetime, or a really good opportunity to springboard your career. There's so much passion and energy involved, and it's something that you desperately want and probably well deserve. And the biggest mistake I think people make is they come in and they can oversell themselves, and they can be dismissive of the obstacles or challenges that they'll be facing in the new role. When you do that at a more junior level, you can get away with it. But when you're interviewing for a senior level leadership role, usually the CEO that you're talking to, or the C-level person, or the board member, in the end, they're going to be looking for a partner they can sit down, have real frank business discussions that they can trust, that understand the obstacles in front of them, and they want to be sitting with someone that wants to be in the best position for themselves and the company, even if it doesn't work out. And you really need to come in and have the confidence to have a frank discussion, acknowledge obstacles, acknowledge what you can do, acknowledge what training you may need or how you'd get support on things. But don't try to oversell, because that can break down the trusted relationship that you have.
And one of the things I was just reading the other day is like when you make, I think it was Amy Cuddy, there might have been an article that I just was reading a couple days ago. It said the first two things people are trying to assess when they first meet you is trust and respect. And, I've talked to an awful lot of people who, when it comes to dealing with, as you said, the CEO, the board member, that senior executive, their goal in terms of their own personal development is to be able to more quickly establish trust. I'm wondering if you have any advice, especially where it's an interview and it could be a short conversation. I'm assuming, maybe an hour. Is there any advice you have on that?
That's a really good question. To quickly establish trust. I think that the best way that I can learn to trust somebody is when they're really listening and paying attention, and they're listening to learn. When they're doing that, you know that they at least are treating you enough, and maybe that gets the respect to enough of they have enough respect for you to want to learn from you and answer the questions appropriately for you. And then I think on the trust, which is really hard in an interview, I get it, is acknowledging mistakes or things that can go wrong.
So Dave, my next question, I appreciate, when it comes to somebody preparing for an interview, I really love your advice about it's really important to establish trust to be able to show that you're listening, you can learn from the person. I think that's fantastic advice. I think now I want to turn the tables and say, if I'm the hiring manager, from the perspective of the person looking for the leader, what are some of the common mistakes you see them make when they're trying to get the best talent for their firm?
Yeah. I would say that's another good question. I think the number one mistake is they make a decision too quickly. And every study and interview shows that people usually make a decision within like 3 minutes, which is crazy. Then they begin to reinforce their beliefs by either asking easier questions or more difficult questions. And so sometimes we can actually tell like how a hiring manager likes somebody, because we can tell when they start asking easy questions, they like them. When they start asking harder questions, they don't like them. They're trying to reinforce.
Oh, that's interesting.
Their preconceived beliefs, exactly. And so I would say that's the biggest mistake. And then really dive into try to figure out when they were leading and when they were managing. And when they were leading, who was making the decision and really how they came about designing what they were trying to do. Quite often, someone we put in a role, let's just give an example. They've come out of a big company where consultants have always told them what to do or designed the strategy, and all they were doing was implementing. Well, if you want that person to design strategy, it could be a little problematic for you. So just because they've been involved in executing the strategy doesn't mean they've been involved in the design. So that's another big mistake that people make.
That is great advice. Yeah. And something just popped into my mind from years ago when I was at State Street. There was a situation where we, pulled somebody into a role. My boss had pulled someone into a role who was fantastic at executing, and he handed him basically an entire program to create from scratch. And he was really basically paralyzed. Fantastic at executing, but not so good at strategy and starting with a blank piece of paper. So I think that for me, where we worked side by side, I realized that was the first point in my career where I realized there was such a big distinction between the two. And now, of course, through the years, I can see it. There's some people that you give them a big, complex project and they're all over it. They can implement it better than anybody. But if you're asking them to start from scratch and actually create the strategy, it may be a challenge. So, that's really good advice. So, Dave, in terms of your own leadership success, I know that, like I said, you've been the CEO of a very successful company, and I'm wondering, what do you wish you'd known earlier in your own career? Are there any lessons you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think it's some of the things that you've brought up in this interview and things that in this conversation and things that you and I have talked about when you've been doing consulting with us is really learning how to put people in the right roles and thinking about that and empowering them to be the best they can to succeed. And I think too often early on in my career, and I can still do it, is a problem comes and I want to fix it. And I may not spend enough time, if I'm not careful, really helping the person get there themselves. And also, if they're having trouble getting there, maybe they're not in the right role. Maybe we need to surround them with different tools. How do we help them execute well in their job without micromanaging or diving into everything? And I think young leaders especially entrepreneurs that are quite often the most passionate and know their product better than anybody else and know it, it's so easy for them to try to pull every lever. And no matter how smart or good they are, they're just not going to scale for them eventually. And I see that's the mistake that people make.
Yeah, I think that's such great advice, Dave, is that, early in our careers, realizing what an important role it is for us to teach, guide, coach, and mentor and, empower and all the things that you've talked about today. So really, really great advice. I really appreciate all the time you spent with us today. And so, Dave, my last question for you is if somebody listening, maybe they have a need to, hire talent for their team. And I'm curious, what's the best way for somebody to reach out to you or a member of your team?
So I think with me, it's probably to connect with me on LinkedIn, and just shoot me a quick note in the subject letter. Just don't say I want to connect with you, because a lot of people try to do that, which is fine. But just give me a quick note on that and connect. You can call into our company. People, if they can, feel free to ask for me, and I will, either help them myself or turn them on to someone in our company that can do so.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave. And to all our listeners, this really has been absolute gold. You've shared so many great tips, advice, and perspectives. So thank you, Dave.